Hi there, it's Michael Vandenham, and on today's training tips, I'm going to talk about starts. Now starts sort of have two components. One is physiology. If you're a good sprinter or a snappy rider, chances are you're capable of having a really fast start and maybe even winning it. But that's only one part of the equation. There's also the technique and practice to have a consistent start. Even if you aren't a good sprinter or snappy rider, these tips are going to help you have a consistent start to put yourself in the position where you can win the bike race later on, even if you're not the first one around the corner. So there's actually two different ways that you can sit on your bike for starts. The first of which is sitting on the nose of your saddle with your unclipped foot on your tippy toes and your clipped in foot with your pedal just above parallel. The second way is to be hovering just in front of the nose of your saddle. This way you have your unclipped foot flat on the ground, ready to push off, and your clipped in foot in the exact same position. As usual, there are a couple benefits and disadvantages to each one of these. If you're sitting on the nose of your saddle, that means that you're connected to your bike right off the bat, and there's a few less moving parts. This can make your start even more consistent. However, you are sacrificing that initial push off of your foot that you get if you're hovering in front of the saddle. That said, if you're hovering in front of the saddle, you can push off, but like I said, a little bit less consistent. It might take some more practice to be able to find that pedal and get clipped in as quickly as possible. The next thing we can think about with starts is pedal position. So you have your clipped in foot somewhere just above parallel. You want to feel like you can put power into it right away. But where your pedal is in your unclipped foot actually matters as well. I always rotate my pedal a little bit so it's lined up with the crank arm. And the reason I do that, this way when my pedals spin around and I catch it with my unclipped foot, the pedal's lined up and gives me a way better chance of clipping in right off the bat. But since we're talking about clipping in, you have to recognize that it's not going to happen right away every single time. But that doesn't matter. I want you to keep pedaling. Even if it takes 4 or 5 pedal strokes until you find that foot, you can still sort of keep up with the group and not lose your start, even if you're not clipped in. The next thing I want to talk about is gear choice. When you're doing a start, you should be in a gear where you have to shift within 3 or 4 pedal strokes of getting off the line. You want to be able to accelerate quickly and then shift as you get up to speed. As you can see here, I'm shifting multiple times when I take off. So how do you find what gear you use? The best way to do that is experiment and recognize that every start's a little bit different. Starting on grass might require a lighter gear than starting on pavement. Starting on an uphill might require a lighter gear than starting on a flat or even downhill start. So what I typically do when I show up to a race is I go to the start, I do a mock start, and see what gear feels good. Try a couple ones out if it doesn't come right away. Like I said, every course is different, so it's important to practice this when you're actually on the start that you're going to be doing later in the day. All right, now let's talk about your upper body. So first off, I like to be in a pretty ready position, a little bit of a crouch, kind of that dynamic position where you can explode into the bars as quickly as possible. The other thing that I'm doing is lightly squeezing the brakes as we get close to the start. That way, the second the whistle lets off, I can let go of the brakes and I already have a little bit of momentum moving forward. Finally, when you actually start pedaling, this is the point where you want to work on having a good sprint. This means standing for as long as possible. I see a lot of people sitting down in their start, and when you do that, you're just not giving yourself the best opportunity to go as quickly as possible. So I want everyone to try standing until they feel like they can't be on top of the gear anymore and their legs are getting tired. Now, we've talked a lot about getting off the line, we've talked a little bit about shifting, but the next thing to remember is the start isn't just about going in a straight line from point A to point B. The start's about getting around the corner and the first series of corners. So it's also important to look at the course and go, where do I think this is going to go? Do I think it's going to bunch on the inside? Do I think it's going to bunch on the outside? Do I think some gaps are going to open up on the left or right? The best way to tell this is actually to go and watch a start from an earlier race. What happens in an earlier race is typically going to happen on yours. So if you see a pinch point on the inside of a turn, maybe make a note of that and try to avoid it. You want to be able to set up for the first corner, the second corner, the third corner, and whatever else follows in as best position as possible. So don't get mesmerized just by going, hey, I got to that first corner quicker than everybody else. You actually want to be able to go around that first series of turns quicker than everybody else. Now, a question I often get asked is, This is great if you start on the front row, but what happens if you're starting in rows 4, 5, 6, somewhere near the back? And again, that's where reading the course, watching the earlier races, and seeing where the pinch points show up becomes really important. So my typical goal when I'm starting further back is, if I can, is to start near the edges. There's almost never gaps in the middle, but there's almost always gaps on the far outsides of the course. So start near the edges, even if that means maybe starting a row back than you could, and then try to pick those spots where you can move up. Finally, the best thing you can do for this to get a consistent start is simply to practice it. Like all of our skills. It doesn't mean that you need to do a full 30-second effort every time, but you can just go through the mechanics of doing a couple good pedal strokes until you clip in with both feet. You can do that 10, 15 times during a single session. The great thing is, you also have the opportunity to practice the start basically every time you come to a stop sign or a red light on your normal training rides. Those, instead of just being an annoyance, are actually opportunities, especially with lights, to wait for it to turn green and try to get off the line, clip in as quickly as possible, just like a race simulation. I hope that helps. Thanks for joining me on Training Tips, and I'll see you next time.